What makes your life heavy is not the world, but the seriousness with which you believe in the character you think you are. It is not the situation itself, but the importance the mind injects into it. It is not the movement of life, but the fiction of a self at the center of everything, demanding control, guarantees, recognition, permanence. And while this self is treated as something solid, everything becomes a threat. A word hurts too much. A rejection feels devastating. A delay feels intolerable. A mistake feels like condemnation. A glance feels like judgment. A silence feels like abandonment. Not because life is so grave, but because the mind has turned a role into identity, a mask into a face, a reflection into essence. This is where the prison begins, and this is where it can collapse. Urine points repeatedly to this central error, replacing what you truly are with the story of who you think you are, and from there, living hypnotized by your own drama. You take yourself seriously because you confuse yourself with the narrative. You take the name seriously. You take the past seriously. You take others' opinions seriously. You take success and failure seriously. You take seriously the self-image you built to survive socially. But look honestly, is everything you protect so carefully stable, continuous, always the same? The image you call I does not remain intact throughout the day. It changes according to the environment, according to who is in front of you, according to the praise you receive, according to the humiliation you fear, according to the results you obtain. At one moment, you think you are strong, then you feel inadequate. At one moment, you feel special, then you feel ordinary. At one moment, you feel in control, then you feel like a victim. So which of these is you? Which one is real enough to deserve such devotion? What is said in essence is that this image called I is just an image. It does not plow the field. It does not cook the rice. It does not sustain life. Before all the I's and me's, there was already that which sees. Understanding this does not destroy life. It destroys the solemnity of the character. And that changes everything, because the moment the character loses its status as absolute reality, the game is seen as a game. And when the game is seen as a game, it stops enslaving. There is still action, still choices, still consequences on the relative plane. There is still a body, language, work, encounters, losses, tasks, commitments. But the psychic glue begins to dissolve. You no longer enter each scene as if your entire existence depended on it. You play better because you are no longer desperate to win. You speak more clearly because you no longer need to defend an identity. You listen better because you are not translating everything into offense or approval. You move more intelligently because life stops being a courtroom and becomes again a field of manifestation. This is what almost no one realizes when they hear that everything is a game. The ordinary mind interprets this in two equally blind ways. Either it falls into cynicism and thinks, then nothing matters, or it falls into spiritual fantasy and thinks, then I will become indifferent to everything. Neither is understanding. The game does not mean falseness in a vulgar sense. The game means appearance, role, movement, relationship, expression, scenario, function. The game is real as experience, but not absolute as identity. Pain may arise, joy may arise, fear may arise, loss may arise, pleasure may arise, but the error is concluding. This is happening to me as a separate and definitive entity. That me is the central piece of the illusion. Without it, experience continues, but psychological suffering loses its fuel. Thus, it is insisted that life is an impersonal process. The river flows, the grass grows, the sun shines, events unfold, thoughts arise, emotions appear, the body responds. There is participation, but not a personal director at the center commanding the totality. And this strikes directly at the secret vanity of the ego, because the ego wants to be the author, the owner, the controller, the absolute protagonist. It wants to say, I did it, I failed, I lost, I succeeded, I was hurt, I was ignored, I was betrayed. But look more deeply. Before you say, I thought, the thought has already appeared. Before you say, I felt, the sensation has already arisen. Before you say, I decided, multiple invisible layers of memory, impulse, conditioning, and perception were already operating. So who is this I that arrives afterward, claiming authorship of everything? In large part, it is merely the late commentator of what has already happened. That is why taking yourself so seriously is exhausting. It requires the continuous maintenance of an imaginary center. It demands constant defense of a mutable image. It demands permanent monitoring of others' approval. It demands comparison, performance, remembrance of the past, projection of the future. It demands that you carry the fantasy that you must sustain someone all the time. And in this, an absurd amount of energy is wasted. Much energy would be freed if it were not spent maintaining the self-image. Most people do not live, they manage a character. Most do not perceive, they interpret. Most do not encounter life, they encounter their own stories about life. And here, the point deepens. You do not take yourself seriously only on a social level. You take yourself seriously inwardly. You take every thought that arises seriously. You take every mental fear as if it were prophecy. You take every memory as if it were identity. You take every fantasy as if it were destiny. But thoughts are merely stories about a self and an other. Stories that come and go and distract from the recognition of what is. So the game begins to be mastered exactly here, when thought loses the right to define reality. Thought can continue arising. There is no need to kill it, no need to wage war against the mind. Because, as observed, controlling the mind does not lead to freedom. It only adds another chain to the prison. The point is not to control every mental movement. The point is to see that it is not you. It appears in you, is known by you, is illuminated by something prior to it. That prior something is not a concept, not a philosophy, not a refined belief. It is the very consciousness of being. The simple fact that everything appears to a silent knowing that has no form. Thoughts appear, sensations appear, roles appear, states appear, but that which knows does not become any of them. Sadness is known, therefore it is not the knower. Fear is known, therefore it is not the knower. The personal image is known, therefore it is not the knower. And if all of this is an object in consciousness, why continue kneeling before these objects as if they were your being? Why take so seriously a passing cloud to the point of forgetting the sky? In Vedanta, this is the beginning of real discernment. The unreal does not need to disappear for the real to be recognized. Appearance does not need to be destroyed. It only needs to stop being confused with essence. The role continues, but the actor is no longer hypnotized. The body continues, speech continues, functional intelligence continues, the relative world continues, but the fictitious center, the imaginary weight, the contraction of I am this threatened character begins to lose consistency. And then something paradoxical happens. You become more effective precisely because you stop existing psychologically as the center of the play. You act with more precision, suffer less anticipation, learn faster, correct more easily, fall without turning it into identity, rise without turning it into pride. You hear criticism without collapsing. You receive praise without inflating. The game is mastered not by the one who controls everything, but by the one who is no longer stuck to the role being played. To master the game, then, is not to win every round of life. It is not to manipulate reality to satisfy your whims. It is not to become invulnerable, superior, or special. That is still the ego dreaming of a spiritual throne. To master the game is to see the rules without being possessed by them. It is to know that on the plane of form, everything changes, everything turns, everything appears and disappears. It is to respond appropriately without turning the response into identity. It is to enter and exit roles without forgetting that no role is your being. To use the name without becoming the name, to use the story without living inside it, to use the mind without reducing yourself to it, to be in the world without being imprisoned by the inner commentary about the world. That is why, once this is understood, a silent laughter begins to arise, not cynical laughter, not mocking laughter, but lucid laughter, because it becomes evident how much of your pain was fueled by an overly theatrical interpretation of something that never had solid substance. The drama seemed unquestionable because the character seemed real, but when the character is seen as a character, something relaxes. The body may still carry old tensions, conditioning may still reappear, certain wounds may still be triggered, but now there is space, there is seeing, there is disidentification, there is presence. And as indicated, when the personal is taken as the reference point, life is seen through a keyhole. When the personal steps aside, fullness can be discerned. So perhaps the question was never how to make life stop hurting you, but how to stop turning every movement of life into confirmation or threat to an imagined self. Perhaps it was never about winning the game, but about waking up from the hypnosis that makes you confuse the role with the player, and the player with the very consciousness in which both appear. Perhaps the point is not to become someone better within the dream, but to recognize who it is to whom the entire dream appears. And what if this someone you defend so seriously is only a mental reflection? What if your deepest dignity does not depend on any narrative? What if the greatest power is not in reinforcing the person, but in seeing through it? And what if that which observes all of this right now is already free, whole, untouched, simply waiting for the next idea of I to arise so it too can be seen as just another piece entering the stage? And that is why almost no one wants to see this fully to the end, because realizing that the character is not the center feels, at first impact, like a loss. It feels like something is being taken away. It feels like your importance is being attacked. It feels like your story is being diminished. It even feels like a kind of death. And in a certain sense, it is, but not the death of what is real in you. It is the death of the demand to be someone fixed, the death of the need to be right all the time, the death of the hunger for validation, the death of the fantasy of control, the death of the image you have been feeding as if it were sacred. And perhaps that is exactly why so much pain arises when life touches this point. Because every time life contradicts the character calls it injustice, failure, humiliation, rejection, ruin. But life may simply be doing what it has always done, tearing apart everything you cannot carry into truth. See how this shows up in the most ordinary situations. Someone does not respond the way you expected, and instantly an entire theater is born. It is no longer just a message. It becomes disrespect, doubt about your worth, abandonment, the need to interpret, anxiety, mental reconstruction of scenes, the impulse to compensate, to please, to demand, to withdraw, to attack. And all of this happens in seconds, not because the facts contain all of that, but because the character needs to turn every event into a personal narrative. It does not know how to simply let something be what it is. It must convert everything into a mirror of its identity. And so life stops being lived and starts being read as a sequence of confirmations or threats to the self. This is exhausting at a level most people have normalized. A person calls it normal fatigue, when in fact it is the weight of sustaining someone who never existed as they imagine. They say they are exhausted because of problems, but much of the exhaustion comes from the psychic management of the character, from the effort to appear coherent, strong, interesting, worthy, and not weak, lost, insufficient, ordinary. And this effort never ends, because no image can give you rest. Every image must be protected. Every image can crack. Every image depends on the gaze from outside or the approval from within. That is why the ego lives in vigilance, It calls this prudence, maturity, strategy, personality. But beneath these words there is fear. Fear of being no one, fear of not being seen, fear of not sustaining the role, fear of disappearing. But here is the point that changes everything, and once seen, becomes like a thorn of lucidity that cannot be removed. What in you truly fears disappearing? Look without rushing to answer. Do not use theory. Do not use ready-made phrases. Just look. The body has its reflexes. The mind has its conditioning. Emotions have their movements. But there is something that has been present in all your states: childhood, adolescence, phases of pride, phases of shame, victories, losses, clear days, chaotic days. Everything changed. Tastes changed, fears changed, beliefs changed, the face changed, relationships changed, goals changed, inner language changed. But the fact of being aware, did not depend on these changes. So why do you keep handing your peace over to what changes, instead of recognizing what never needed to be manufactured? The character keeps asking the future for salvation. More recognition, more stability, more money, more clarity, more healing, more respect, more answers, more guarantees. And the almost cruel detail is that even when it gets what it asks for, peace does not last, because what was obtained is absorbed by the structure that lives from lack. The ego does not know how to rest in fullness. It only knows how to relaunch deficiency in another form. If before there was a lack of love, then there is a lack of security. If before there was a lack of security, then there is a lack of freedom. If before there was a lack of freedom, then there is a lack of meaning. If before there was a lack of meaning, then there is a lack of permanence. It is a machine for renaming emptiness. That is why taking it seriously is entering into an endless contract. You promise to feed an entity that does not want to finish eating. And perhaps one of the most uncomfortable realizations is this: much of what you call my life is just the maintenance of this machine. You think you are seeking happiness, but often you are just seeking a more comfortable version of identity. You think you want truth, but you still want to be someone special who found the truth. You think you want peace, but you want peace so the character can continue existing undisturbed. You think you want freedom, but you want freedom for the ego to choose its preferences without frustration. And until this is seen, even spirituality becomes part of the character's game. It starts collecting elevated ideas, subtle states, profound phrases, symbols of awakening, but everything still orbiting the same imaginary center. I. And now more sophisticated, quieter, more philosophical, more refined I, but still an I that wants to last. This is where the vision must become ruthless, not against the body, not against the mind, not against life, but against the lie. Because the lie is not only in big things, it is in the small inner affirmations, in the way you narrate events, in the way you take offense, in the way you compare yourself, in the way you imagine being seen, in the way you turn experience into personal property. And as long as this appropriation remains invisible, the game will continue to dominate you. You will still believe you are playing, when in fact you are being played by conditioned reflexes that call themselves identity. Mastering the game begins when you see the fraud at the exact moment it forms. A thought of inadequacy arises, and before you fall into it, you see, this is a cloud, not a verdict. A humiliating memory arises, and before turning it into identity, you see, this is a memory appearing now, not essence. The impulse to defend, justify, control, show off, diminish yourself arises, and something silent sees all of this as movement, not as command. This seeing is revolutionary because it does not need to fight. It does not argue with the mind. It does not need to win any debate. It simply illuminates, and everything that needs darkness to seem solid begins to lose strength. But do not confuse this with passivity. Many people, upon hearing that the person is a functional fiction, Imagine that nothing matters and any attitude will do. No, on the contrary, when the ego leaves the center, response becomes cleaner, more precise, less contaminated by fear and vanity. You can say no more firmly because you are no longer trying to preserve an image of being nice. You can leave with more dignity because you are no longer begging for validation. You can acknowledge a mistake more honestly because you no longer see it as the collapse of your worth. You can love more purely because you are no longer using the other to reinforce identity. You can act with more courage because you no longer feel that every scene determines your existence. Action becomes more whole precisely because it stops serving the character. And here perhaps lies one of the most radical shifts this understanding can produce: the gradual end of psychological humiliation. Not apparent social humiliation, but that intimate feeling of having been diminished in your being because of an event, a word, a rejection, a loss. As long as you think you are the image, any scratch on the image feels like ontological mutilation. But when the image is seen as an image, the event may still hurt, but it no longer reaches what you are. The blow hits the role, not the presence. Rejection hits the expectation, not consciousness. Loss hits form, not being. And this is not cheap consolation. It is a shift of axis. It is the difference between living as surface and living from depth. So what once seemed devastating begins to be seen in another light. The person who left may have taken a narrative, not your being. The project that failed may have broken an image, not your reality. The mistake you made may have exposed conditioning, not condemned your essence. The shame you carried for years may have survived only because no one showed you that it too was an object seen, not the seer. And when this finally lands, not as a beautiful phrase, but as a living seeing, many things collapse. The cult of self-importance falls. The attachment to inner reputation falls. The need to constantly explain yourself to yourself falls. The hunger to turn every experience into sacred autobiography falls. And in that moment, life acquires a lightness that the mind does not understand. It is not superficiality, not irresponsibility, not coldness. It is the absence of unnecessary weight. You still feel, but you do not drown in every wave as if it were the entire ocean. You still think, but you do not kneel before every thought as if it were revelation. You still play roles, but you no longer demand eternity from any of them. You still participate in the world, but you no longer ask the world to tell you who you are. And this changes the way you walk, speak, wait, lose, love, work, age, fall ill, be seen, be forgotten. Because when the seriousness of the false center falls, the entire world stops revolving as judgment and begins to appear as movement. Perhaps that is why certain truths are so frightening, because they do not offer the character a better version of itself. They do not crown it, they do not decorate it, they pierce it, decentralize it, reveal that almost all your agony came from protecting a ghost with religious devotion. And then the question can no longer be so easily ignored. How many decisions in your life were made to protect an image? How many relationships were maintained out of fear of hurting the character? How many opportunities were lost because the I did not want to seem inadequate? How many silences were endured? How many humiliations swallowed? How many performances maintained? How many desires suffocated? How many masks defended just so this fiction could continue appearing real? And what if almost everything you call personal suffering has been the inevitable friction between living life and the impossible attempt to freeze it around someone who never had substance of their own? And what if freedom begins exactly at the point where you stop asking the game to confirm the character and begin to see, in the midst of every scene, who is it that is truly seeing all of this happening right now?